China didn't send one ship. China sent a message. A wave of warships and military hardware moved toward Venezuela under a clean diplomatic banner: defense assistance, joint exercises, maritime security. On paper, it sounds routine, almost boring. In reality, it's a hard signal that Beijing believes a critical asset is under direct threat. Because Venezuela is not just a fragile country with instability and headlines. Venezuela is an oil valve and a geopolitical pressure point sitting close to the United States, exactly the kind of place where regime survival can be turned into leverage. For years, China poured money and long-term commitments into Venezuela through financing structures tied to oil flow, infrastructure deals, energy contracts, and political backing built around one outcome: continuity, not ideology, not friendship. Continuity. Because continuity keeps barrels moving, keeps obligations from turning into losses, and keeps sunk capital from becoming ash. But now Washington's pressure is pushing toward regime-level consequences. Squeeze oil revenue, tighten financial routes, weaponize compliance, and signal that leadership itself could face personal consequences if the standoff escalates. From Beijing's perspective, that's not simply pressure on Caracas. That's a threat to erase years of Chinese capital and credibility in a single strike. If Venezuela collapses under U.S. pressure, China doesn't just lose a partner. It loses money, leverage, and the belief that Chinese backing can protect a government when American power decides to squeeze hard. That is why the fleet arrives. It's not charity, it's insurance. The kind of insurance designed to change the cost of interference. Because a tanker alone is commerce. A tanker under the shadow of escort becomes geopolitics. And geopolitics carries escalation risk by design. That's the entire logic of deterrence. You don't need to fire first. You need to make the other side calculate the possibility that firing could happen. Now add the second shock that turns this from a regional crisis into a global tremor: strategic materials. In this scenario, Beijing doesn't respond only at sea. It responds inside the U.S. economy by tightening the flow of rare earths and processed inputs that modern industry quietly depends on. Rare earths are not a headline commodity. They are the hidden skeleton of high-tech manufacturing: magnets, motors, sensors, precision components that decide whether factories run or stall. When China tightens access through licensing friction, approval delays, expanded dual-use definitions, or selective enforcement, the damage is not instant like a missile strike. It is slow, like poison. Production slips, inventories drain, costs rise, margins shrink, orders get canceled, layoffs begin, and political pressure spikes. The public only notices at the end of the chain, when prices rise and jobs vanish. But the stress begins earlier, in procurement offices where just-in-time becomes not in time. This is why the rare earth squeeze is such a powerful counterpunch. The U.S. threatens regime survival and oil revenue. China threatens industrial rhythm and supply chain stability. Leverage versus leverage. Strangulation versus strangulation. And once both sides start pulling, neither wants to be the first to let go. That's how escalation ladders form. First, Washington signals it can raise pressure beyond economics into personal consequences for the regime. Second, Beijing raises the physical cost of interference by moving naval assets into the theater under friendly branding. Third, Beijing signals the economic battlefield is not one way by tightening strategic material flows. Fourth, markets begin to price in disruption. Oil volatility, shipping risk premiums, insurance costs, and the possibility that the rules of trade are being weaponized at scale. At that point, even without a single missile, the global system starts behaving as if it's entering a storm. Because energy uncertainty and component uncertainty are the two lifelines that break modern economies fast. When energy becomes volatile, everything becomes expensive. When components become scarce, everything becomes late. Combine both and you get the worst macro mix. Inflation pressure returns while growth weakens. Central banks hesitate. Investors flee risk. Companies freeze hiring. Households feel it last through higher bills and shrinking job security. That's why 2026 becomes dangerous. Not because anyone wants a great power war, but because the world is being pushed into warlike behavior. Escorts, seizures, export controls, sanctions, tariff threats, and constant miscalculation risk. The darkest part is that escalation doesn't require evil intent. It requires friction. One boarded vessel, one detained crew, one radar lock, one warning shot, one collision. Maritime confrontations compress decisions into minutes, and a small mistake at sea can become a national humiliation on land. Humiliation creates political pressure. Political pressure creates retaliation. Retaliation creates momentum. Momentum creates the incident nobody planned. And then everyone is trapped inside it. The first conflict that arrives rarely looks like war. It looks like paperwork. The light path begins with tariffs, compliance warfare, sanctions expansion, and the quiet weaponization of trade infrastructure. Washington's strongest advantage is not a strike. It's the ability to make commerce too risky to touch. Secondary sanctions, insurance exclusions, port restrictions, banking fear. The moment the U.S. signals that any ship, insurer, trader, or bank touching Venezuelan crude could face penalties, the private sector reacts faster than governments. Shipping firms don't wait for enforcement. Insurers don't wait for the first fine. Banks don't wait for the first headline. They price the risk immediately, and once risk is priced, activity shrinks. This is how flows slow without a blockade. The oil doesn't vanish, but the system that moves oil becomes afraid to touch it. That fear is enough to lift prices because energy markets trade on confidence as much as supply. Traders hedge, logistics firms raise rates, airlines pay more, trucking pays more, manufacturing pays more. And as costs rise, the political temperature rises too. Meanwhile, China's answer in the light path doesn't need to be a dramatic embargo. It can be a controlled slowdown that feels bureaucratic but bites like a knife. Tighter export licensing, longer approvals, broader security reviews, new documentation demands. The effect is delay inflation, inventory drains, substitution costs rise, delivery schedules break, penalty clauses trigger, earnings miss. Layoffs start. And once layoffs start, leaders face pressure to prove strength. That's the paradox. Economic pain does not calm crises down. It narrows choices. It pushes leaders to seek more leverage. And that's how the light path escalates into the medium path, maritime enforcement. The medium path begins with one event at sea, an inspection, a boarding attempt, a detention, a seizure. On paper, it's law. In reality, it's a test. Because once Chinese naval assets are present as escorts, any attempt to stop or seize a tanker becomes a direct challenge. The confrontation doesn't need missiles. It can start with shadowing. A Chinese ship positions itself between an approaching vessel and a tanker. Radio warnings sharpen, maneuvers tighten, distances shrink. Everyone stays professional. And that professionalism is what makes it dangerous because professionals follow rules of engagement, and rules of engagement are written for deterrence, not for saving face. The sea compresses time. Diplomats can negotiate for weeks. Ships must decide in minutes. A captain can't wait for a committee while another hull cuts across his bow. He turns, He accelerates, he signals, he reacts, and reactions become incidents. Incidents become headlines. Headlines become domestic outrage. Domestic outrage becomes orders. Orders become escalation. Markets respond differently to the medium path. The light path creates volatility. The medium path creates fear of physical disruption. If traders believe tankers might be stopped, they don't just hedge, they hoard. They scramble for alternative supply. They build inventories. That behavior tightens the market on its own. And in a tight market, even a small disruption produces a large spike. That spike spreads into inflation expectations, currency pressure in import-dependent countries, and financial stress in places already living close to the edge. This is how a regional standoff becomes a global energy shock without a declared war. Then comes the worst-case path. The moment the medium path crosses a line into a story leaders cannot politically tolerate. A warning shot, a drone downed, a radar jam, a ship damaged, a sailor injured, a crew detained, something visible, something humiliating. At that moment, the narrative flips from enforcement to attack. And once attack enters the narrative, leaders lose room to maneuver. They respond not because they want war, but because they fear the cost of not responding. This is how great powers slide into conflict, not by desire, but by commitment traps. They've invested too much reputation to walk away, and Venezuela becomes a trap because both sides tie credibility to outcomes. China's fleet becomes a tripwire. If Beijing claims it is protecting a partner and safeguarding shipping, then failing to react to a challenge looks like weakness. The U.S. posture becomes a tripwire. If Washington claims its rules must be enforced, then allowing Chinese escorts to neutralize pressure looks like weakness. Two tripwires, two domestic storms, two incentives to escalate. And escalation rarely stays contained. Once the worst-case path triggers, it doesn't stop at Venezuela. Cyber pressure rises. Financial restrictions widen. Other shipping routes become riskier. Other flashpoints become linked. The world shifts from a crisis to a climate, a new normal of confrontation. And that's why 2026 becomes a storm year. Not only storms in the Caribbean, storms in markets, currencies, and politics. Because the global economy runs on confidence. Stable energy, stable components, predictable rules. Break confidence and capital retreats. When capital retreats, growth slows. When growth slows, politics hardens. Hardened politics makes compromise harder. The loop feeds itself. But the end game is not predetermined. The final layer is psychology. What each side truly wants, what each side fears most, and what kind of exit could exist without humiliation. Washington's core objective is to preserve the credibility of its enforcement toolset. Sanctions reach, financial access, insurance and banking influence, and regional deterrence. It cannot easily accept a rival power creating a protective shield around a sanctioned partner in its hemisphere because that sets a precedent that U.S. pressure can be neutralized by a peer. Beijing's core objective is to preserve the credibility of its global network, that Chinese financing and partnership are not a one-way bet that can be erased when the U.S. tightens the screws. It cannot easily accept Venezuela collapsing under U.S. pressure, because that teaches every other partner a brutal lesson. Chinese support does not protect you when American leverage turns hard. That's why both sides fight for credibility. And credibility is the one prize that makes compromise politically toxic. The way crises cool is almost never through friendship. It's through face-saving, quiet concessions, narrow exemptions, third-party buffers, back-channel deals that let both sides claim they didn't blink. One exit is a compliance theater arrangement. Washington claims stricter monitoring and symbolic enforcement while quietly allowing certain flows under narrow carve-outs. Beijing claims it stabilized shipping and protected a partner while reducing the visibility of its naval posture. Another exit is a buffer mechanism that reduces direct contact at sea. Protocols, monitoring frameworks, or intermediary channels designed to prevent two armed ships from being forced into split-second decisions. Another exit is linkage, easing one pressure point in exchange for easing another, so both sides have incentives to step back. The key is not the details. The key is giving both sides a story they can sell at home, because the real danger is not when the crisis is loud. The real danger is when it looks manageable, right before the next step makes it unmanageable. If the standoff doesn't cool, the world doesn't need a declared war to feel warlike consequences. It only needs persistent disruption. Higher energy prices, tighter supply chains, rising risk premiums, and more political anger as households absorb inflation and job uncertainty. And political anger makes leaders more aggressive, not less. That is how economic conflict becomes strategic conflict, and strategic conflict becomes incident risk. Venezuela is the point where two lifelines intersect, oil and materials, and where two great powers are testing credibility in a confined space. If both sides keep tightening, the system will respond with instability even if no one intends catastrophe. But if a single maritime mistake turns deterrence into humiliation, then the crisis will stop being about policy and start being about pride. And pride is the one variable that markets cannot price until they are forced to.